Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 201, Ruins that Suddenly Collapsed. When this female demon died, whether it was her tentacles or her pitch-black flesh eggs, all of them began to shrink. They dried up in a manner visible to the naked eye, turning into black powder just like rotten vegetation. Kant slowly raised his left hand, indicating to stop the attack. However, there were still 4 Swadian sergeants on both sides who raised their shields up and walked to the stone platform to check the results of the battle. Seeing that her skull had already been split open by the all arrows, piercing through the back of her head, they turned their heads and nodded at Kant. They put away the half-sword in their hands and said, "She has been killed." "Very good." Kant nodded and praised the people of Ravenstone beside him, "Very decisive. You flatter us." The ranger and forest warden bowed slightly, appearing very modest. After all, these were all archers. Excellent archers. When they saw this female demon, the disgust towards evil in their hearts had already begun to stir. Without Kant's permission, they almost couldn't help wanting to shoot, and the order from the Lord made them feel completely relieved. They drew their bows and shot arrows, killing the female demon that was emitting a dense evil aura, like an intruder in the underworld. The people of Pandey continent were born to hate all creatures in the underworld. Kant naturally understood. This was the reason behind Pandey's worldview. And the order he gave to shoot came from the mission issued by the system. They walked forward. Kant came in front of the body of the female demon who was shot into a hedgehog. Her beautiful oval face had been pierced by more than 10 cone arrows until she looked like an alien. Looking at her miserable appearance, she was almost on par with that other demon goddess. He shook his head slightly. His eyes were still calm and indifferent. He placed his hands on his temple, and data spread. All the things that had happened in history had nothing to do with him. Kant knew. The key was to absorb the power of these ancient descendants to make the system stronger and his power increase. That was the only thing he could rely on to survive in this world. Ding, through your tireless efforts, you have completed this mission. Main quest, absorb again completed. Reward, system's new function is activated. Explanation, when you thought that you would win by defeating the opponent, you didn't expect that danger would appear again. The 2 women didn't seem to belong to the same camp, but it didn't matter. You also didn't belong to their camp. Absorb the new female demon, the system will once again gain new rule power. The completed dialog box popped up on his retina. Kant's mind hit it. The system had already activated 2 new functions. However, he was temporarily unable to check because after Kant gave the order to kill the female demon, as the pitch-black tentacles and flesh eggs withered and shrunk, even the golden light in the sky began to shake and dissipate. In just a few short minutes, half of the golden light had already disappeared. Lord Kant. Manide raised his head to look at the dissipating golden light, solemnly reminding Kant, "This place seems to be a bit dangerous. I think it's best to evacuate this ruin now. After all, this is the interior of the mountain. If it collapses, we'll be in grave danger." "That's right." James nodded in agreement. "We'd better retreat immediately." The golden light above their heads shone like the sun, giving them some assurance. But these golden lights were dissipating. The entire place and the interior quickly became dark. Even the ordinary soldiers felt that once these golden lights disappeared, something bad might happen. It was best to retreat quickly, lest they were caught unprepared in the face of danger. "Let's go." Kant nodded as well. However, he looked at the huge stone coffin with pity. There was a slightly smaller golden coffin inside. Judging from the purity of the color, it was the purest gold. If it was transported out, it would probably be enough to buy the title of the Count of the Dukedom of Leo, as well as a piece of land. That golden coffin was really priceless. Crack, crack, crack. Kant was about to speak and ask the soldiers behind him to pry open the golden coffin to remove it, but he did not expect that there would suddenly be violent shaking under his feet. Even the originally neatly cut stone slab had a certain undulation of the terrain that caused the interior of the ruins to slowly shake. A large amount of dirt and stones began to fall with a crash. Like a rainstorm, the golden light that was still spreading and refracting in the sky quickly became small and dim at an extremely fast rate. This place is going to collapse. Manide and James were shocked. They grabbed Kant's hand and wanted to run toward the cave. This was the interior of a 1,000 meters deep mountain. Or it could be said that was the bottom of the mountain. If this thousands of acres of space all collapsed, it would elicit the collapse of the entire mountain. Millions of tons of soil and stones would pour down directly, submerging them in the ruin. By then, this place would really become a mausoleum. Their mausoleum. It was not worth it to die because of such a thing. However, when everyone surrounded Kant and ran towards the cave, an even more violent tremor appeared. A few hundred meters above their heads, a rock that was dozens of meters tall collapsed with a rumble. With a loud noise, it crashed directly between the original position of the stone platform and the cave's stone door. Boom! The infrasonic waves and air waves caused by the huge rock smashing down instantly sent Kant and the others, who had already entered the stone door and the cave's tunnel, flying away. Violent air currents instantly surged out. It was as if they were in a storm and could not help themselves. They whistled and flew 4 to 5 meters away. Then, because of the sudden disappearance of the air wave, he fell heavily onto the stone pavement of the tunnel. A cough cough. For a moment, a painful cough was heard. In the dark tunnel, the air wave even sprayed the accumulated bones out along the tunnel. This caused everyone to fall without a buffer layer, allowing their bodies to withstand their inertia and weight. With the chain armor on their bodies, it was probably no different from being hit by a heavy hammer. Splash splash. There was a slight sound, but the sound was getting louder and louder. The people who were still coughing looked at each other, especially Manide, who was used to living in the sea or rivers. He turned his head to look at the ruins cave behind him. Is it the sound of flowing water? He said in shock, "It's water." Boom. Before the people could react, an even louder sound appeared. It was indeed the sound of running water. However, compared to the sound of the water seeping out and hitting the stone slabs, it was more like a flood that directly broke the dam. With a destructive momentum, it violently surged into the ruins. Boom, 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 boom. The waves were squeezed out of the narrow space. The sound of the waves hitting each other and struggling was like an angry roar. And at the back, with the torch that the Rhodix had brought with him, the entire cave alley suddenly lit up. Although it was dark, it was still barely visible, and one could see clearly 7 or 8 meters away. That's... Manide's breathing was somewhat hurried. James, who was beside Kant, also widened his eyes. It's water. That's right, it's water. And a lot of water. A violent surge came from within the stone door. It was like a rising tide, rising at a speed visible to the naked eye. It even soaked through Rhodix's familiar spear-wielding boots at the bottom. Retreat quickly. Kant's order rang out. Only then did they react and continue to climb up the tunnel. Their injuries from the fall had recovered quite a bit. These soldiers, who were originally strong, supported each other and surrounded each other. Under Kant's lead, they quickly walked towards the light at the end of their vision. This was because they knew that that was their path of survival. As long as they escaped to the location of the light, they would be able to survive if they saw the sky of the Scenway range. Boom, 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 boom. Just behind them, the sound of water flowing and collapsing could be heard continuously. Every time, it was like a bomb falling. Because the water was spreading in the ruins, the air in the ruins was compressed. There was a gust of strong wind blowing from the inside to the outside in the entire alley. It was as if it was pushing them to quickly escape from this area. In less than 10 minutes, they had already seen the light that was right in front of them. Kant was the first to drill out. Behind him, James, Manide, as well as the infantrymen and archers, came out one after another. And right inside the cave, the rumbling sound of water was still ringing in their ears, making their eardrums ache faintly. Even the natural sound of birds chirping and beasts chirping could be heard from time to time in the sceneway range. They could not hear anything at all. They could only feel the rumbling sound of water that seemed to be continuous and never stopped. "Let's, quickly, leave this place." Manide moved closer to Kant's ear and shouted loudly, "It will collapse. It's dangerous." "I know." Kant nodded and also shouted loudly, "Everyone, retreat immediately. Leave this mountain. We're leaving, now." However, their eardrums were ringing, and no one could hear clearly. They could only act according to their gestures and mouth movement. After leaving the cave, they returned to the peak of the mountain. Aaron's village, which was originally located here, was not affected in the slightest. It was just that the 20 skilled Rhodex spear wielders and 20 skilled Rhodex crossbowmen who were stationed there, and because of the panic caused by the loud noises, when they saw Kant and the others, they quickly came over and bowed respectfully. At the same time, they reported on the situation they had encountered. "Let's go." Kant did not speak any nonsense and could not hear the report clearly. Instead, he pulled them to the north and pointed at the smooth slope and paved road, shouting, "Let's go." If the thousands of acres of cave collapsed, this mountain would suffer as well. Collapsing was a good thing. If there was a large-scale collapse, the entire mountain would be completely overturned. Staying on top was equivalent to waiting for death. Rhodex's village had disappeared. If he was lucky enough to draw another village, he could continue to build it. If he died, then everything would be in vain. Kant would not let his life be threatened at all. He cherished his life very much. The soldiers behind him were also running quickly with him. The obedient warhorse and single-humped camel seemed to have sensed the shaking of the ground and quickly came to their side. They stopped to be ridden by their respective masters, or they brought additional people along the paved road and quickly rushed towards the desert outside the mountain range. In short, it was necessary to stay away from this mountain top. Chapter 202, A Village that Profited from a Disaster. They only stopped when they were out of the range of the two mountains. Their eardrums returned to normal. The sound had also continued to transmit new waves. "Who?" Kant opened his mouth to stop the warhorse beneath him. He turned his head to look at Manide and James, who were covered in dust beside him. He did not need to look in the mirror to know that he was definitely in a sorry state with dust all over his face. If they retreated from the tunnel, it would be equivalent to running away. If not, they would die in the collapse or be swallowed by the flood that came from God knows where. When that happened, they would be extremely miserable. It was not the time to care about their image at the moment of life and death. Kant did not have too many mysophobia. How lucky! James looked at the mountain behind him. He said with some lingering fear, "If we encountered an even more violent collapse inside, even if we were not buried alive, we would probably be swallowed by the sudden flood and drowned alive. If we did not walk faster, the consequences would be unimaginable." Yes, it was really dangerous. Manide also swallowed his saliva in fear. The surrounding soldiers panted heavily in agreement. The danger encountered during this exploration was almost as dangerous as when the expeditionary army of the Kingdom of Greymane came to attack. However, this time, it was even more terrifying and direct. If they had not retreated quickly enough, they would have been completely annihilated. It would be difficult to survive. Kant's expression was somewhat gloomy. He turned around on the horse and looked at the mountain peak in the distance. That was where his village, Aaron, was located. However, it was about to collapse and disappear along with the violent tremors, causing the Kingdom of Rhodex to lose its name in his development system. Damn it! Kant gritted his teeth. He really didn't expect that there would be such a huge ruin hidden under the mountain peak chosen by the system. He also didn't expect directly killing the two survivors who had lived for unknown reasons in history, would lead to a total collapse that almost caused him to die in that ruin. It was extremely dangerous. Even now, he could still hear the faint rumbling sound. It was the sound of the mountain collapsing. It was even above his head. Circles of unknown birds had already flown into the sky, covering the sky and the sun as they flapped their wings. It was obvious that they were also at a loss because of the sound of the collapse of the mountain. The wild beasts in the surrounding mountain range also let out a series of roars. Boom, boom, boom. However, Kant's expression suddenly changed, and he turned his head in shock. Manide and James, who were behind him, also looked down in shock at the side of the paved road. Following the deafening sound, a wave of foam-covered water, which was more than half a meter high, rushed out of the canyon between the mountains. In an instant, it passed by them, who were still on the road. When they were building the road along the system, they deliberately widened and increased the height to form a concave canal, which rushed towards the entrance of the mountain range that they were about to advance into. In an extremely short period of time, it formed a depth of about 3 meters. The river that was 4 to 5 meters wide also became smooth because of the surging waves. In a short moment, it actually formed a river. What's going on? James opened his mouth and subconsciously looked in the direction that the river was rushing towards. He recalled the huge torrent that suddenly appeared in the mountain that he had escaped from. He could not help but swallow his saliva. He guessed, could it be that behind the ruins is actually a subterranean river? Subterranean river? Manide nodded silently and said, perhaps, it really is so. At the bottom of this 1,000 meters tall mountain. If it was not for the subterranean river or the subterranean lake, it was absolutely impossible for such a huge torrent to appear and directly crash the mountain. It was even blocked by the crevices of the canyon on the periphery of the Sceneway range and the paved roads. It formed this small river. Although it was small, Kant thought it had reached the stage where it could sail a boat. Moreover, Kant looked back and suddenly realized that even if the village of Aaron had disappeared, the region on the edge of the mountain range would have extremely high development value because of this river. The river represented the most basic agriculture. As long as the terraces were cultivated on both sides, the abundant river water represented irrigation. Although it extended into the desert and seeped into the ground to form underground water, the underground water near the mountain range would also become abundant, allowing the vegetation to grow more luxuriant and more suitable for the development of agriculture. If they were lucky, after several years of cultivation, this place would definitely become Kant's agricultural production base, maintaining the foundation for future development. The food problem would not be controlled by others. The collapse seems to have stopped. Some of the Swadian rangers on the single-humped camels looked behind them. Their senses were more sensitive, so they quickly noticed that the sound of the collapse behind them was also decreasing, and finally, it became barely noticeable. Is it over? James and Manide also looked behind them. Everyone had a look of regret on their faces. The faces of the Rhodoks people were even more sorrowful. Obviously, the disappearance of this village made them even more sorrowful. After all, this was a village of their own race, and they had deep feelings for it. However, Kant frowned slightly. He did not notice a message from the system that the village had been destroyed. He raised his head and looked at the mountain peak in front of him. There was a gust of dust flying into the sky due to the air waves. It was like a grey fog that had slowly drifted down along with the collapse and shaking that had disappeared. It was like a fog that could be clearly seen. However, this scene made Kant frown even more. If the mountain really collapsed, the phenomenon would not be so simple. The sky collapsed and the earth cracked. Countless clouds of dust rushed into the sky. The earth was shaking, and countless cracks extended onto the surrounding mountains. The entire mountain range that was connected to it would probably collapse in that area. It was like a small-scale earthquake. But now, it ended so easily. The tremor and the loud sound of the collapse did not even reach Kant. How could he not be suspicious? "Let's go back and take a look," he ordered. "Lord Kant, is it dangerous?" Manite advised. The surrounding soldiers were also worried. Maybe not. Kant spoke and turned his head to look at the side of the paved road. The river was still flowing smoothly. It did not dry up due to the passage of time. A few thoughts appeared in his mind. He could not help but say, perhaps our village will benefit from this disaster. 20 Swadian knights, follow me. Kant made up his mind. He turned his head and ordered, the rest of you, wait here. Understood. The knights replied. James and Manite also turned their horses around and came to Kant's side. From the looks of it, they were also planning to follow Kant back to take a look. They could not be at ease if they let Kant, the Lord, put himself in danger. They rode their horses quickly and lightly. They soon returned to the foot of the mountain where Aaron's village was located. The paved road was still intact. However, at the foot of the hill, a huge crack appeared at the foot of the cliff on the west side, forming a spring water that kept gushing out. A small lake more than 50 meters wide and more than 100 meters long was formed in a depression, and it followed the valley where the road foundation and drainage ditch were located. It began to spread toward the outside of the mountain range, forming a small river that Kant saw. They raised their heads and looked up. There was nothing unusual about the entire mountain top. Even the city wall at the top of the mountain was still standing. There's nothing wrong with the village. James looked happy. Let's go and take a look. Kant gently knocked on the horse's belly and used the speed of the warhorse to directly rush up the mountain top along the paved road. He looked at the council hall that was still standing, the 10 Rhodoc-style houses, and the 7-meter-tall sentry tower, and his face was filled with joy. Clearly, there was no problem. When he got closer, he saw that the whole building was still intact without even a crack. Kant could not help but smile. When Verga's construction team comes over, I will reward them with a great deal of dinar. The quality of these buildings is very good. They deserve a reward. Manite smiled and nodded. Kant smiled and looked around. He was extremely excited. A mere payment dinar could not express his happiness at all, especially the appearance of this river. It was much more affordable than the reward. This was the agricultural foundation that could guarantee survival. The only regret was that the priceless golden coffin was not produced. But it was enough that the village had not been destroyed by the collapse. If this errand still existed, everything would still exist. Kant's strategic layout was not disrupted. On the contrary, it was a blessing in disguise. There was an opportunity to develop agriculture here. In his opinion, with sufficient irrigation, the agricultural development here was much better than that of the Oasis lookout. There was no need to care about the extreme heat and water sources. He could directly open up the mountain land and build up the soil to form effective terraced fields. Let's go take a look at the cave. Seeing that the village was fine, Kant also looked to the west. The ruins in the cave were the source of the current situation. Although he knew that the inside would definitely be washed away by the flood, and the falling stones would also shatter a lot of the internal structure, overall, since the mountain did not fall and cave in, it meant that the collapse inside was not too serious. Perhaps if Kant and his men worked hard enough, they could still recover the gold inside. He would never forget about the gold. It was still dark inside the cave. Standing on the platform outside the cave, Kant turned his head to look at the cliff next to him. There was a large amount of white bones scattered down, but it was like a mass grave underneath. At the same time, there were many small carnivores moving through it, but no meat was found, so they could only fiddle with some white bones before burrowing back into the dense bushes. These were the white bones that were directly blown out by the air waves in the cave. There was no need to trouble Kant and the others to clean them up again. The torches that were left behind previously were reignited. There was no difference from before in the cave. Only the faint sound of water flowing could be heard. But it was not that roar either. Instead, it became more stable. It sounded like a slowly flowing subterranean river in a karst cave. Occasionally, there would be layers of sounds from the reefs, which carried a bit of playfulness. Be careful. After entering the cave and advancing for more than 500 meters, the ground became slippery. It was obvious that the waves had once risen here. Manide and James were a little afraid. If they did not escape quickly, they would be swept into the waves and dragged back into the flood-filled ruins. That would really be a disaster. However, their fear was quickly dispelled by their shock. They arrived behind the two stone doors that had been pushed open. The huge statue of the god on the opposite side was still there. Although the golden light was still as dim as dusk, making it hard for people to see, it still provided some visibility. The people saw that the originally flat stone ground had formed a half-meter-high lake, and near the stone platform in the distance, a large black hole had already opened up. Clearly, the water from the subterranean river had poured in. On the south side of the stone wall, a cave that was more than 10 meters wide had also opened up. The subterranean river disappeared in the cave, bringing along a gentle flow of water. No one knew where it led to. Chapter 203, Aaron's Prosperity. Perhaps this ruin had cut off the underground river in the mountain range when it was built. If anything unusual happened, it would trigger a self-destruct program, causing the underground river water that had been accumulating for thousands of years to suddenly pour down and destroy everything in the torrential flood, making the ruin a tool to destroy the enemies so that they could all perish together. Perhaps through thousands of years, an underground river eroded the karst cave, causing the river water to connect with each other and change its course. This was very common in the natural environment. After all, in close to 10,000 years' time, anything could happen. These speculations were reasonable, but they were not of much help to the present. Knowing history could help one understand the truth of gains and losses, but history was only experience after all. It was an anecdote that could not provide any help to Kant now. It was something that was dispensable. Kant did not need to know what had happened here in the past. Similarly, he did not need to know that the goddess in the ruins had survived in the golden coffin for at least 10,000 years, or that female devil who claimed to have broken the seal because of the weakening of the golden light. What kind of grudges did she have? The current era was not the era of the gods. Even if the so-called gods returned, Kant would not let them go. Just like how the gods would not allow anyone to challenge their authority, Kant, who had no faith and was not protected by the gods, was definitely an existence they wanted to erase. Kant could not offer his soul to the gods for protection. From the looks of it, the two sides already had irreconcilable conflicts. And it was the most intense kind. But we must be thankful that this is the age of chaos. The once high and mighty mages and priests also have to bow their heads to the swords in our hands. Even the demons have to die in front of the arrows. Kant's voice appeared behind the stone door. He turned his head to look at Manide, James, and the Swadian knight who were standing on both sides of the stone door with a dull look on their faces. He said in a deep voice, "No one will be a match for us. This is what I firmly believe in my heart." James was slightly older, so he quickly reacted. "Under your leadership, this will definitely happen." "Yes, yes." The others also nodded in agreement, and at the same time, they looked back at the stone door in shame. The scene inside the stone door still shocked them. Although they had seen the magnificent internal sculpture, architectural structure, and the almost spacious space, they had still attracted the attention of the demonized wolf and the two female enemies, so they did not observe it carefully. Now, he relaxed. When he inspected it again, the ruins that had collapsed due to the flood, although it was less solemn and serious, it had an awe-inspiring quality condensed through time. The stone platform under the statue was still there. The stone coffin wrapped in the golden coffin was also on the stone platform, and on the left and right sides, there were the god's descendant saintesses dressed in gold threads, as well as the female demon wrapped in a black cloak with a goat horn on her forehead. They were all corpses, and their deaths were equally miserable. "That's good." Kant heaved a sigh of relief, and his gaze became even more fervent. The two worthless corpses could be casually thrown into the subterranean river, but not the several tons of golden coffins. If the coffins were really washed away by the flood, or if they were to sink into the deep river beyond the stone platform, Kant would definitely not be happy. This was equivalent to giving up the ready-made dinar. The leader of the trade caravan from Rivaden, Jocelyn, had once said that gold could be exchanged for dinar. Although he did not specify the price. But just by looking at Jocelyn's seriousness, it was clear that the exchange rate was definitely not low. No matter what, gold was the hard currency of various plains and crystal walls. The same was true for the continent of Karadia. This water source was the agricultural foundation for Aaron's long-term development, and this gold was definitely the spoils of war that allowed Kant to harvest a large amount of dinar and obtain more opportunities for development. As for whether this golden coffin was a rare object, Kant didn't care. If he could earn a large amount of dinar, so what if it was a rare object? He wasn't lacking in rare objects at the moment. However, Kant raised his head slightly and swept his gaze across the two stone statues at the edge of the stone platform. They were made to look like they were kneeling down. Their hands were holding up the two sun discs, which were still emitting golden light. Therefore, although the entire interior of the ruins was dark, it was still barely visible. However, the flood continued. The stone floor outside the stone platform collapsed, forming a deep and dark subterranean river. Under the golden light shining above, one could still vaguely see an unknown large fish that was more than 1 meter long swimming back and forth, occasionally breaking the surface of the water with its dorsal fin, slightly black scales arranged neatly, looking carnivorous. There were not many vegetarian fish in the subterranean river. Ready-made fish. Manide raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at the flood outside the stone gate. There were many small and delicate groups of fish swimming along with the 1 meter long large fish, appearing and disappearing in the flood. He could not help but turn his head and smile at Kant. I really envy Aaron Village. It seems that not only do they have more game, but they can also develop their fishing industry. This underground river could be used to catch fish. Just by looking at the abundant fish, one could tell that this underground river was rich in natural fish resources. Moreover, the water that seeped out from the cracks in the mountain, the small lake that formed at the foot of the mountain, and the small river that extended all the way out of the mountain range were all natural environments that could be used to raise fish. With a little modification of the terrain, it could form an artificial fishing ground. As long as Kant had fish species, he could quickly cultivate many fish. Making smoked fish and increasing the variety of food was definitely not a dream for this village Aaron. It could be easily realized. Moreover, all kinds of game were added to make dried meat and open up the mountain to form terraces. Every autumn, one could harvest a warehouse full of grains. It was definitely an important base for agriculture. In terms of development prospects, this village Aaron had surpassed Drondheim almost since the beginning of its establishment. Because the resources here were really too rich. It was just that it lacked the necessary development. Once it took 2 to 3 years for Drondheim to supply the development of this place, and everything was ready, Aaron would feed Drondheim back, moving into a mutually beneficial phase. Kant didn't plan to develop Aaron into a castle. Instead, he would choose cities as the basis for the next level up. After all, a castle was the key to controlling a certain place, and it was used for military purposes. In terms of people's livelihood, agriculture, commerce, and other development, it was completely backward, or it could be said that it was purely military-centered. Drondheim's military level up was because there were external enemies. On the other hand, Aaron had no enemies. Even if it had potential enemies, they were only wild beasts and demonized creatures in the mountains. Therefore, the nature of the two was different. Let's go back. Kant had already made up his mind. He led his team and left the stone door and the cave passage. This ruin had already become his possession. The entire area around Aaron was also Kant's possession. Now, they only needed to develop. The golden coffin was still on the stone platform, waiting to be made into a small sampan in the future. It would be fine as long as people went over to separate it and transport it out. Naturally, the thing that was already firmly in Kant's pocket wouldn't be able to escape. The construction of the village, Aaron, was completed. In order to ensure development, Kant stayed in the Seenway range until the end of the month before finally preparing to leave. This was also because James and Manide were worried about Drondheim, so Kant was the first to return. During this period of time, the village Aaron continued to develop rapidly. 20 traditional House of Rodix were neatly arranged next to the council hall. They formed 3 small streets with the 10 houses that had been built previously. They were already occupied by 300 fleeing Rodix peasant farmers. Furthermore, on the south side of the council hall, the flat land on the mountain peak close to the depths of the mountain range had basically been flattened into farmland. But because the soil layer was thin, and some areas were less than 20 centimeters, they were still full of broken stones. So these peasant farmers were using hoes to search for soil on other mountains, carrying it back in rattan baskets, and artificially starting to pave and raise the soil layer, to lay the foundation for future agriculture, so that they could quickly cultivate the mountain fields that could be planted. And just at the foot of the mountain, next to the mountain crack, where the water from the subterranean river gushed out, a water mill had been built. The water wheel turned quickly, driving the stone mill inside to crush the grain and turn it into flour. Peasant carried the flour up and baked it into bread in the kitchen of the house. Wisps of green smoke curled in the air. The village Aaron finally showed some signs of prosperity. On the inner side of the city wall, 40 Ravenstone Rangers with heavy battle bows were patrolling under the lead of 7 Ravenstone Rangers. They vigilantly scanned the situation on the outside of the mountain and guarded the safety of Aaron's village with their superb archery skills, to ensure the stability and ownership of this place. During this period of time, at least 30 blind demonized creatures had fallen under their arrows. Although they were all ordinary species, it also showed how powerful they were. At the same time, 10 Swadian snipers and 20 Rodix senior snipers were stationed in the council hall. They were all using heavy crossbows. The only difference was that level 5 snipers had slightly more proficiency and experience. It had to be said that the Rodix was a natural-born master of crossbows and long-pole weapons. 13 Swadian sergeants and 40 veteran Rodix spear-wielders wielding long-hilted broadswords had already formed an army that could face ferocious demonized creatures. They also had ferocious combat strength. Of the 3 vicious demonized creatures hanging in the council hall, 2 of them had been killed by them. Moreover, it was a battle with no casualties. Of course, the archers of Ravenstone and the crossbowmen of Swadia and Rodix had also provided the necessary help to allow these close combat troop class to deal with the vicious demonized creatures so easily. The combat ability of the soldiers who formed the battle sequence far surpassed that of wild beasts. Chapter 204, Trade Caravans appearing one after another. Everything had stabilized. Kant patrolled the village. Although it was still small, it had a prosperous atmosphere. His eyes swept across the southwest corner. 10 3-meter-tall kilns made of stone and mud rose in spirals. However, this green smoke was not obvious because it was only a dozen meters above the mountain peak. It dissipated in the gentle mountain breeze that appeared in the Seenway range all the time and could no longer be seen clearly. This was the only building that produced goods in Aaron's village at the moment. Charcoal kiln. It was dedicated to the Oasis Lookout's salt-making workshop. At the same time, it provided Drondheim's family with supplies for heating at night. Now, 30 Rodix peasant farmers were in charge of it. After all, besides transporting the charcoal to Drondheim, Aaron, where he was, also had a lot of demand for it. For example, the long strips of meat that the hunting team brought back after being skinned and dissected had to be smoked and roasted using the charcoal. They were sprinkled with a layer of fine white salt while it was hot and hung in the shade, waiting for it to dry naturally. This would form dried meat that could be stored for a long time and provide more meat for Drondheim. The animal and plant resources in the Seenway range were not lacking at all. The hunting team only roamed around the nearby mountains and surveyed the terrain. They were able to harvest a lot of prey. The enchanted creatures had already been eliminated. The remaining ones were wild boars, sand gazelles, elks, pheasants, hares, foxes, and other small wild animals. There were also many large wild animals such as wild wolves, black bears, lions, and cheetahs. However, none of them were able to pose a slightest threat to the forest rangers in Ravenstone, the hunting team that was formed with Rodix's peasants. Instead, they became the main source of dried meat in Aaron's village. At the same time, the mountain that had been cleaned up was also planned as a forest farm to vigorously develop the logging industry. At the foot of the forest farm, there was a small river formed by the subterranean river surging out of the ground. There were also logging farms set up on both sides of the paved road. Every day, a large amount of wood was cut down and transported to the side of the lake at the bottom of Aaron's village, where professionals were waiting to deal with this batch of wood. The wood was directly chopped into lumps and transported to the charcoal kiln at the hilltop to be burned into high-quality charcoal. This was currently Aaron's complete planning process. The subsequent planning had also been preliminarily followed. Kant, Manide, and James had inspected the hilltops on both sides of the river. The area where the hillsides were relatively flat was the place where the logging industry was vigorously developing. There was a lot of enthusiasm in cutting down trees. When all the trees on these hills had been cut down, they would be leveled. Although the Rodic people did not have the technology to build terraced fields, this technology was not a top secret that could not be learned. On the contrary, it was not difficult to imitate. Kant, who had the experience of his previous life, understood this in his mind. It was completely possible to experiment on the leveled hills, and eventually perfect the formation of a top-grade terraced field that could grow lush crops. For this, a week ago, the river beside the paved road was slightly dredged. It blocked all the overflowing streams. At the same time, it dug up the mud in the shoals and other places, making the depth of the river close to 2 meters. The valley between the mountains was originally the flow route of the flood after the previous rainstorm. After years of erosion, it had long formed a river channel. However, it only appeared during the summer rainstorm, and now it had become a constant flow of the river. According to Manide, this small river could be used as a boat. Although it could only be used as a small sampan 1 meter wide. But it was still considered a boat. Hundreds of sampans 1 meter wide and 3 meters long were carried down the river. The cargo carried by them could exceed the load of hundreds of pack horses. Moreover, their speed was very fast. As long as one was careful of the winding river channel between the valleys, it would not take more than 30 minutes for one to walk the distance that would take a trade caravan of horses or camels nearly 4 hours to travel. The mountain where Aaron's village was located was quite far from the edge of the mountain range where the desert was located. Although this was still the outer area of the Sinway range, compared to the entire mountain range, this so-called outer area was still a daunting and huge area. One had to know that when Kant entered the mountain range, even if there was a systematic road, he would only arrive at this place from morning until dusk. It took him almost half of the day. Even if he built a paved road, just by using the cavalry to ride war horses and travel at a fast speed, it would take about 3 hours to reach the foot of the mountain peak from the entrance, not to mention the slower trade caravan. Kant even had a longer-term plan. If it was possible, when he extracted a new spring, he would definitely place it on the way to the river to replenish the water. He would even let the river go deep into the Naran desert and pass through the vast dune. He would go straight to the Oasis lookout where Drondheim was, connecting the two of them. If that was the case, it would take them less than 3 days to travel back and forth between the two places. The two banks of the river would become oases. Just like the two banks of the Nile River, they would use a large number of river plants that were suitable for living on sandy land, as well as a large number of trees to resist the erosion of the desert, or even reverse the erosion of the desert, forming a wider oasis along the river. It was somewhat unrealistic. But it was indeed Kant's ambition. His plan was to use the system mall to draw in a large number of springs or lakes and other natural environments, and complete it in 10 years' time. He would establish the connection between the rivers and roads between the two places, completely binding them together. At that time, the southern part of the Naran Desert would be completely under his control. With the river transportation as a weapon of mass destruction, his heavy armored troops could reach the two places at an extremely fast speed. They could even reach any part of the river between the two places to launch a counterattack and surprise attack on the enemy. Even if this ambition was unrealistic, Kant could achieve it with the help of the system. For him, who was still young, as long as he chose to wait, the future would not be grim. With the right time, the right place, and the right people, time would stand on Kant's side. Aaron's village was on the right track. Kant temporarily handed over power to James and planned to start his return journey. 50 Swadian knight followed him back to Drondheim, while Manide led the camel team, 7 Mamluks and 20 desert bandits to the Stone Pass again. 40 sacks of fine white salt were still on the back of the one-humped camel. The table salt trade for this month still had to continue. Manide was currently fully in charge of this task. At the same time, he could also purchase a large number of tools and food. Indirectly, he could use the great silver coins he obtained to turn them into raw materials. When he transported them back to Drondheim, he could also transport them to Aaron, who needed them more. He had to speed up the development of this Rhodoks village. To a certain extent, Aaron's potential for development was much greater than Drondheim's. Let's go. After leaving the area where the stone roads were paved, Kant led his team into the Naran Desert. Scorching air waves surged over. Although it was early in the morning, this feeling made Kant, who was used to the cool climate of the mountain range, feel a burning and tormenting feeling. Even though he quickly familiarized himself with it, he still felt quite uncomfortable. No one would like the cruel environment of the Naran Desert. He shook his head slightly. Kant shook the reins and the group continued to ride forward. It would take them a day and 2 nights to reach the post house, and then they would have to walk for a day and a night to finally reach the Oasis lookout. Time was still quite tight. They left at the beginning of the month. It was already the end of the month. Kant delayed the level up of Drondheim. After all, in the middle of the month, the fortress on the Oasis could be upgraded to a castle level up. Of course, the delay was well worth it for Kant. The new village, Aaron, was on the right track. According to his calculations, in a year's time, he would be able to feed the military castle of Drondheim on a large scale as a town. At that time, both sides would coordinate with each other from the north and south. They would be as solid as horns. When the development reached a certain level, new villages would continue to appear. After all, as the controller of the southern part of the Naran Desert, the lord of the entire Naran Desert in name, Kant's forces could not rely on these 2 points to support themselves. If possible, Kant would also arrange for new villages to be built in the depths of the desert. This was to prepare for the forces that would come into contact with the Mannheim coast in the future. Moreover, after Kant returned to Drondheim, he would also put this plan on the agenda. A new system appeared. There were still 2 types. Kant hadn't studied it in depth, but he was already deeply shocked. Because the appearance of the 2 systems brought about 2 completely different extraordinary powers. And it was these extraordinary powers that gave him confidence. Even if he came into contact with the Mannheim coast in the north of the Naran Desert, he still had the confidence to protect himself. He even had absolute control over his own region in the south, even if it was the powerful Grey Mane Kingdom. Once again, he organized the Jack Allen Expeditionary Army to come and fight. Kant was also confident that he could defeat them once again in the Dune. Moreover, the victory in the Seenway Range was extremely fruitful. The sun set and the sun rose. Kant led his team back at top speed. Soon, they arrived at the post house. 10 Swadian recruits quickly came over to greet them. At the same time, 40 desert bandits were also informed to return on horseback. They only wanted to salute Kant and report the latest news. They were the garrison forces that had just been stationed at the post house this month. They usually scouted the desert. However, after Kant arrived, the news they reported was not optimistic. What? A lot of scouting guys appeared in the desert. With a slight frown, Kant sat on the chair, holding a wooden bowl in his hand. He did not care about drinking the cool well water. Instead, he asked the 4 desert bandits in front of him, "What's going on? Why are there so many people? I remember that before the beginning of the month, no one came to the Naran desert, right?" "That's true," the desert bandits replied. "We have already beaten back 3 waves of self-proclaimed trade caravan guys, and there was one time when the other party almost went to war despite our dissuasion. They really came fast." Kant lowered his head slightly, and his thoughts wandered. He raised his head and praised, "You guys did a good job." However, he still put down the wooden bowl. He knocked on the table and said, "Next, I will continue to mobilize some Sarandian horsemen to help. This is the only way to the Oasis lookout. You guys have to pay more attention to the situation around you." "Understood," the desert bandits replied in a deep voice. Chapter 205, The Changes of Drondheim. This was within Kant's expectations. The post house was the only way to pass through the rocky pass and the Oasis lookout. As long as there were people who wanted to test Kant and came to the depths of the desert disguised as trade caravans, they would pass by this flat sand plain. The post house that was being built in the middle of the sand plain could be said to be extremely conspicuous. No one would give up the idea of testing the post house. Moreover, in the area around the possible routes, 40 desert bandits would carry out continuous patrols. When they discovered that there was an unfamiliar trade caravan visiting, these extremely agile and valiant desert bandits would go over and say that Kant had issued an order forbidding them from going deep into the desert. If they encountered any stubborn resistance, they did not mind pulling out the scimitars at their waists or the short javelins on their backs to let the other party experience the cruelty of the desert. Even if the guards of the trade caravan were extremely powerful and could withstand these desert bandits who were weaker in close combat, it would be difficult for them to withstand the harassment and attacks day and night. The desert bandits were very good at this kind of alternate guerrilla tactics. Therefore, they relied on this tactic to continuously harass the trade caravan, letting them sense the danger. After hearing the good advice, they went to the post house to replenish fresh water and food, then turned around and returned, not daring to go deep into the Naran desert. They were afraid of encountering these vulture-like desert bandits and causing some unpleasant accidents. In the early stages, the ones who came to probe were real merchants or some secret agents disguised as merchants. Therefore, they were very professional in the trade caravan. Similarly, they could sense that these desert bandits were not lying. Once they went too far away from the post house, or touched the bottom line of these desert bandits, then cruel harassment would eventually come. Otherwise, they would choose to return to the stone pass. Or they would risk their lives to kill their way to the Oasis lookout. There were only these 2 options. However, no matter how they looked at the second option, it was extremely brutal. After all, after a period of examination, they knew that the Lord of the Naran Desert, Baron Kant, controlled a group of heavy cavalry troops. Although they were few in number, they were extremely elite, be able to fight back and forth with the knights at the Stone Pass and not lacking in power. Naturally, they were talking about the Sarandian horsemen who had once displayed their brilliance at the Stone Pass. It was just a pity. Out of the 20 Sarandian horsemen, only 7 survived. However, even these 7 survivors were successfully promoted to Mamluks. They had the standard of a top-tier knight. In terms of close combat and battle experience, they were even stronger than Grand Knights who had extraordinary strength. The system had instilled tens of years of killing experience into them. It was equivalent to fighting through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. The effect was naturally extraordinary. However, based on the current strength of these spies from the trade caravan, they were at most ordinary people. They could deal with the desert bandits. After all, the number of guards in each batch of trade caravan would not be too large. Compared to the size of the 40 desert bandits that could gather in large numbers with a whistle, they were at a complete disadvantage. Similarly, they did not dare to have any thoughts of resisting. This was the early stage of testing, and it was not the time to use force to test. Kant's strict blockade was enough to block the gazes of many people. However, this was only temporary. Oasis Lookout's table salt trade to the Stone Pass became more and more formal. The amount of silver coins traded increased, and the overall profit kept rising. It would also attract a large number of greedy eyes. The probing would continue. Once Kant's strength was clear, the new round of probing would arrive. Until they understood Kant's bottom line. Those noble and merchant were like devils from hell. They were not inferior in terms of fighting. This was the work of greed. Kant understood them. Therefore, he made a choice against these greedy fellows. The Stone Pass had already blocked many greedy gazes for him. Without the help of Baron Darren, even more spies and agents, as well as various bandit groups and violent organizations, would have appeared in the Naran Desert, moving towards the Oasis Lookout on a large scale. They would have had to engage in intimate contact. To tell the truth, Kant was currently under very little pressure. Desert bandits alone could deal with the small trade caravan that had appeared in the Naran Desert after bypassing the Stone Pass. The fierce bandits trained in the Sarandian Desert were still like fish in water in the Naran Desert. Moreover, this was Kant's home ground. If they encountered an enemy that they could not deal with the desert terrain and the cruel environment, added to the elite troops that could be transferred to Drondheim, destroying the opponents easily wasn't just a dream. Now, in this vast and cruel Naran Desert, Kant's forces were ranked first. Another trek. Finally, on the last day of the month, Kant returned to the Oasis Lookout. The long-lost stone wall of Drondheim appeared in front of him. The 4 arrow towers and the tower-like council hall were as tall as before, carrying safety and stability. They were the cornerstone of Kant's current forces. This fortress allowed him to occupy this oasis. And the Variga marksman who first noticed Kant's arrival had already passed on the news. Phaetus was leading a team. The Swadian knight, the Swadian heavy cavalry, Mamluks and Sarandian horsemen stomped on the sand, causing the soft sand layer to fly, showing their imposing manner. This was the grandest welcome. "Welcome back, Lord Kant." Phaetus had a solemn expression on his face. The heavy cavalry behind him also looked at Kant with enthusiasm. "Welcome back, my lord." They shouted in unison, their eyes burning with passion, making them offer the most reverent wish in their hearts. "All right." Kant nodded. Looking at these heavy cavalry, as well as the archers on the city walls and arrow towers, his expression was one of satisfaction. These were his soldiers. "Go in," Kant ordered, and entered Drondheim under the escort of many cavalry soldiers. However, he also found that while he was away, although Faith didn't have the authority to level up the fortress to become a castle, he still built Drondheim according to his authority. More houses appeared inside the city walls. More pedestrians came and went on the streets, and the atmosphere was bustling. Green smoke curled up from the salt workshop all day long. Piles of salt were placed on the wooden boards, waiting to be filled. More than a dozen workers were holding shovels and loading the fine white salt into linen bags. As the salt sprinkled, it looked white and beautiful. It was quite tempting. The sugar workshop next to them was also smoking. However, there were fewer goods. Due to the lack of raw materials, the sugar workshop was limited. However, with the hard work of the honey and the output of the date palm tree, the thumb-sized date palm candies were finished. They were also packed in linen sacks, and then carefully transported to the storeroom, waiting for their own internal digestion. The sugar production has not yet formed a grand scale yet, so the products are produced for their own consumption. Chapter 206, Beginning of the Castle Level Up. The raw materials needed to make sugar were quite hard to get. At present, Drondheim could only mix honey and date palm to make original mixed sugar cubes. There was no technology to make higher-level sugar. For example, maltose, which could be produced from wheat, but no one knew how to make this kind of sugar. As for other sugars such as white sugar and brown sugar, they needed to be extracted from the beets, sugar cane, and other plants that were rich in sugar. Of course, according to the research of the Saradian, if date palm was refined, perhaps rough sugar such as brown sugar could be obtained. However, it had not been thoroughly studied, so brown sugar did not appear. Compared to salt, which was a rich natural resource in the desert, sugar was obviously a little more troublesome to obtain. However, everything was developing at a high speed. Perhaps before long, date palm, which was rich in sugar, would be successfully studied. Then, Kant would able to produce new kinds of goods for the commercial exchanges with the world. Sugar-rich cash crops such as sugar cane, sugar beet, figs, and date palm could even be used to make dried fruits and produce fructose. These crops could be grown in the desert. Due to the temperature difference, the sugar content inside the fruits could be increased. Kant had already made up his mind. When the Aran village in the Seenway range was developed, the basic wheat fields and flax fields could be transferred over there, leaving Drondheim with only the cash crops that produced sugar. At that time, the Oasis lookout would not only be a military castle. It would also be a workshop center that could supply the entire human countries with salt and sugar. With these two condiments, which were comparable to luxury goods, a large amount of great silver coins would flow into Kant's pockets. The profiteering was no less than the spice trade. This was because all these resources were ready-made for Kant. Salt and alkali soil in the depths of the desert, date palm, and honey of the Sarandian people. All of these did not cost too much. If possible, Kant would even increase the investment in the breeding industry. For example, artificial beehives were all placed in the Aran village. With the rich plant resources in the Seenway range and the flowers that bloomed all over the mountains, it would become a place that could produce a large amount of honey. Together with date palm, batches of date palm sugar would be produced in sugar workshops. And even if it was a spice trade, there might be a chance to try to get into this industry. After all, the Seenway range was close to the Naran desert, hence the natural environment tended to be humid and hot. From time to time, there would be cold and gloomy currents blowing over, caused a very strange climate, but it also created a climate similar to the subtropical mountains. This was precisely the environment where spices such as pepper, cloves, nutmeg kernels, nutmeg, and ginger were easy to cultivate. It was a pity that Kant did not have spices seeds. According to what he knew in the academy, these spices were all purchased from the outer seas. There were no spices in all the human kingdoms and the distant dwarf kingdoms, so these things were extremely precious. That was why spices were equivalent to the great silver coins. Several sacks of silver coins could be exchanged for a small sack of spices. These spices were the luxury items that were only afforded by the nobles. In terms of luxury, spices were far surpassed fine white salt. After patrolling the entire fortress, Kant had a faint smile on his face. He was very satisfied. Especially after observing his own fortress, his plans for the future were much clearer and more intuitive. Kant was in an extremely good mood. He had finally gotten rid of his status as a weak and exhausted little lord. In the next level up, he would even have a brand new and sturdy castle. It was like the most thorough nail, firmly rooted in the Oasis lookout, allowed him to become the indestructible true king of this land. Phyrantus, Kant nodded in praise. During the time I was away, you did very well. Thank you for your praise. Phyrantus lowered his head, and there was a smile on his face after being praised. This is the praise you deserve, Kant said with a smile. Although Phyrantus's internal affairs ability could not be compared to the military command level, the education from the descendants of the great noble families, as well as the knowledge brought by traveling the continent, were not something that ordinary people could compare to. For example, Manet and James were slightly worse than Phyrantus. This was the difference brought about by education. According to the original version of the game, the difference was not large because of the existence of the players. But in reality, it was exposed without a doubt. Among these hero-level NPCs, the one who could be compared to Firentis was probably Alain, who came from the same noble family in the kingdom of Viagirs. However, there was a difference between the two. Due to the problem of education, Alain was more like a general who led his troops to charge at the front. He personally went to the battlefield and bathed in blood to boost the morale of his troops. Firentis was different. He was the commander-in-chief who led his troops in battle. Although he could also charge at the front, the position of commander-in-chief reflected his military attainment. He played his role in tactics and strategy, not charging at the front as a general. Kant had a very deep understanding of the original version. When he came to this world, he also held the same principle. There was no one who was the strongest or weakest, no one was useless. The things that mattered were whether they were put in a suitable position or not, or were they doing the right job, and were they fully unleash their potential or not. Back at the council hall, the peasant women immediately served warm food. It was much more sumptuous than what they had eaten in the Aran village. There were even the freshest roasted lamb chops. This was the best tonic after a long journey. Oh right, I suddenly discovered a strange phenomenon. Kant looked at the golden and crispy roasted lamb chop and seemed to recall something. He put down the knife and fork in his hand, he turned his head and asked Firentis, "It's the end of the month now, but why don't I see groups of sand gazelles starting to migrate? If I remember correctly, these sand gazelles in the Sinway range will migrate in large numbers towards the depths of the Naran Desert at the end of the month. They will only return after they have eaten enough salt when they reach the salt and alkali soil." Yes, that is indeed the case, Firentis nodded slightly and replied, "I have also discovered this recently. The number of sand gazelles is becoming fewer and fewer compared to before." The number of sand gazelle is becoming fewer now, Kant frowned and asked, "This is not normal." "Did you find anything unusual in the Sinway range?" Firentis asked. "No," Kant frowned. Firentis said hesitantly, "Actually, since the end of last month, the number of sand gazelles has been decreasing. If it isn't a problem in the depths of the Naran Desert, then there must be a problem in the Sinway range." "Is that so?" Kant nodded. His analysis was very reasonable. Firentis also shrugged slightly and said in a relaxed tone, "Lord Kant, maybe the last time the expedition army came, they scared the sand gazelle, so they don't dare to come here for a while." "Maybe," Kant nodded. He always felt that it was not so simple. However, the current Drondheim did not need to rely on the sand gazelle as its main food. It was just a source to provide dried meat. And when Kant established Aran in the Sinway range, he hunted a large number of rich wild animals and made them into dried meat. He did not need to rely on the sand gazelle as a source of meat. The current herds of gazelles only served as a source of red meat for Drondheim, allowing people to eat fresh meat. So it didn't matter much. All the prepared food was served. Because it was early in the morning, Firentis accompanied Kant to dine. But the two talked more. After being away for so long, Kant needed to listen carefully to Firentis's report, especially since the construction work and changes of Drondheim after his departure. These were all things to consider when he decided to level up next. The conversation ended at the end of the meal. Kant nodded slightly. "Very good." Firentis reported all kinds of situations and current situations in detail. Thanks to its self-enclosed development, the fortress did not communicate with the outside world. Therefore, the changes of Drondheim were not big, and the changes were all within the scope of control. It did not have much effect on the next level up. Continue to be on alert. Kant wiped the corner of his mouth with a linen towel and wiped the grease off. Then, he stood up and walked to the second floor. At the same time, he continued to instruct Firentis, "I will go back to my room to rest for a while. You will continue to manage the fortress. If there are any abnormalities, tell everyone not to panic." "Understood," Firentus also stood up and nodded respectfully. Kant was talking about the abnormalities caused by the level up. The construction of the Drondheim fortress had been completed. The soldiers were neat and elite. There was no problem for it to be leveled up to castle. He returned to his room. The window was open, the air was dry, and there was no strange smell. He had not been back for a while, and the room was very clean. Obviously, his room was cleaned every day. Looking at the smooth surface of the table, there wasn't even a layer of dust on it, let alone sand. One could see how dutiful were the peasant women who were responsible for cleaning the fortress. He closed the door. Kant lay on the bed that was changed every day. Dialog box instantly popped up in his eyes. His mind had already contacted the system, and he said in his mind, "System, level up." Ding. System prompt. You have the option to level up once. Please confirm the target of level up. Drondheim Fortress / Aran Village. The system quickly gave a prompt. Kant said in a deep voice, "Level up Drondheim Fortress." There was no need to hesitate. Drondheim was his main reliance now. If he could open up a trade route to the Mannheim coast, then this Drondheim would be even more useful. As Kant affirmed, the data flow instantly surged out. The upgrade card that was already in his mind had already turned into pieces. However, on the council hall of Drondheim, the data flow had already completely engulfed the building and was expanding, beginning to produce irreversible changes. The data flow quickly dissipated. The entire council hall, which was built entirely from stone, no longer had the shape of a military tower. Instead, it was the real main body of the castle. Chapter 207, The Data Interface of the Castle. Kant's mind instantly rose to the top of the sky. God's view expanded. The entire Oasis lookout suddenly appeared in a bird's-eye view. In the distance, the lush date palm jungle, the wheat fields with sprouting seedlings, and the sparkling lake water brought the vitality of nature to the surrounding sandy dune. Peasants were busy in the fields, holding farm tools to clean up the ridges they were responsible for. The lake water in the canal was trickling. The well-built canal could connect the date palm jungle with the wheat fields, and the flax fields, and pour water into the lake through the sewer at any time. The canal prevented the date palm jungle, which was ready to bloom and bear fruit, and the sprouting wheat fields to have any possibility of drying up from the astonishing amount of evaporation during the day. The Swadeans knew more about agriculture than any other country's peasant and farmers, even the chickens as well. Those free-range and desert-adapted grouses were not cooped up in their coops, instead they spread their wings and dived deep into date palm jungle or chi grass beach in search of flesh worms. The grouses would not venture too deep into the desert. It was like there was a bottom line that they would not easily set foot in. Every time the peasant women carried flax sacks and called out loudly, these sand grouse would flutter their wings and quickly rush over, enjoying the grains that were scattered on the sandy ground. This was their luxury food. If the villagers in the kingdom of Swadia saw them directly feed the sand grouse with grains, they would definitely wail in grief. The chaotic continent of Karadia didn't even have enough to eat after all. Ding. System prompt. Drondheim has completed its upgrade. Current level, Castle. The dialog box that popped up from the system brought Kant back to his senses. He lowered his head and looked down. The originally tower-shaped council hall had been completely transformed into a tall building made of large stone strips. It occupied an area of nearly 1,000 square meters. The buildings on both sides were pushed out, and the width of the street was less than 5 meters. This was the real main body of the castle, completely different from the previous towers. The height of the 6-story building was close to 15 meters. In addition, there were additional arrow towers at the 4 corners of the castle-level council hall. Even the outer walls were tightly built with a 7-meter-high city wall and a concave-shaped arrow-blocking wall that was 1 meter higher. There were even semi-circular towers extending on both sides of the main gate of the council hall. On top of the tower, there was a thick and heavy gatehouse, which just opened up a gap of half a meter. On the platform next to it, there were a large number of stones the size of a human head. It was estimated that if an enemy attacked the front gate, these stones would be able to smash down fiercely and slow down the enemy's attack. The main body of the council hall had an extremely strict system, which was as well defended as the main bodies of the castles in the game. This building itself was the key to the castle. It could be said that if the entire outer and inner parts of the castle had been lost, as long as this council hall was still intact and had resisted the enemy's attack, then there was still a chance to recover the lost land. Because the very purpose of the castle was this towering building. But why would Kent let his Drondheim fall? It was absolutely impossible. He swept his gaze across the council hall that had already changed. His gaze swept past the surrounding buildings and lined them up densely. It was already unable to accommodate any more new buildings. But with a thought, the system actually popped up a dialog box on his retina. Ding, system prompt. Detected that you have entered castle level, the rules are beginning to change. Detected 2 new rules at the same time, beginning to load the system. 1. Supernatural power rule loading. 2. High-level troop class rules loading. New rules loading completed, the system has successfully fused the new rules. Remark, due to lack of necessary information, the system's rules are lacking. Please obtain more supernatural power for the system to analyze the rules of this world. This was a notification from the system. After a rough scan, Kent could not help but nod to himself. This was the new rules he obtained after killing those 2 women. It was also the reason why he chose to kill those 2 women without leaving anyone alive. Supernatural powers. High-level troop class. These were all terms in fantasy fictions. Kent naturally understood it. And he also understood that when these 2 rules were loaded, it had already surpassed the level of the original version's history. The game had reached the level of the legendary fantasy world. The real fantasy world. Just like the real world Kent was currently in. There were magic, foreign races, and divine artifacts. This was the confidence of Kent for engaging in battles. There were troop classes that were even stronger than the original level 5 troop class. Those abject ancient survivors who had already been squeezed by the age of chaos and had lost most of their strength, what qualifications did they have to compare with him, after he gained such great strength? The absolute power was to have core combat strength. Kent would never give up. On his vision, a new dialog box continued to pop up. Ding, system prompt. You have entered castle class. Reputation and honor system unlocked. You have entered castle class. Recruitment and employment system unlocked. Kent scanned through the new dialog box. The recruitment and hiring system was very simple in the literal sense. It allowed him to recruit higher-level troop class. He could also hire the original version of mercenaries in the tavern, for example, mercenary horsemen, mercenary crossbowmen, trade caravan guards, porter, profession warriors, and so on. These were the various troop class that had appeared in the past. Although most of them were troop class with inferior equipment, their advantage was that they could respawn in the tavern every week. Occasionally, there would be a level 5 top-tier troop class appeared, which could improve the quantity and quality of his troop classes in a short period of time. Kent frowned slightly as he looked at the reputation and honor system. He was quite familiar with these 2 systems. Because in the early stages, when he fought the Jack Allen tribe head-on, it had already been activated after he obtained victory. Now that it was still unlocked, he was indeed a little puzzled. If it was already unlocked, could it be unlocked again? The system seemed to sense his doubt. The system dialog box popped up. Ding, system prompt. Because the initial reputation and honor system were unlocked as a reward for the mission, there are some functions that have not been unlocked. New rules are in place, all functions have been unlocked, please continue to use. Remark, consume 10 reputation points to speed up the construction time by 1 day, consume 100 reputation points to attract a small group of refugees. Remark, consume reputation points to draw high-level items and high-level troop class, consume 10/100 reputation points to level up the estate. The system's explanation was clear. Kant nodded. In his heart, he understood that the new reputation and honor system had also changed. Or it could be called the function unlock. Now, using 10 reputation points could speed up the construction by 1 day, which was 10 times less than the original 100 reputation points. Moreover, it could attract a small group of refugees at the price of 100 reputation points, which was a new function. It was very suitable for the rapid development of Drondheim Castle and Aran Village. Especially Aran Village. With these two new functions, the construction of the village could be completed in a short period of time, and a large number of people could appear in the village. It would perfect the employment needs of each post, and a large number of buildings could be built in a short period of time. This would allow the entire village to enter the level up stage. Because of the honor function of the system, it allowed the automatic level up. Level up the village to a military-type fortress or a civilian-type town by consuming 10 honor points. Level up the fortress or town to a castle or a city by consuming 100 honor points. As for the higher level up, the system did not provide it. Perhaps it had already reached its peak. After all, in the original version, castles and cities already represented the highest level strongholds. As for the other large-scale castles or cities in the mod, such as the capital of the Five Kingdoms and the Nord's castle in Prohisi of Pender, they did not appear. As for the epic-level cities and castles in the Custom Commander, they did not appear at all. Even if these castles and cities were available, the cost of honor points required would be astronomical. Leveling up to a castle required 100 honor points. If leveled up to Drondheim of the Ancient Council, it would require tens of thousands of honor points. It would tire Kant to death while he was doing endless side quest. It was estimated that he would never be able to gather enough honor points in his lifetime. However, there was no need to think too much right now. Kant muttered to himself. The current castle level up had been completed. Next, it was time to start the construction of the castle. After all, after upgrading the castle, these originally fortress-level buildings had lost their former effects. They were all replaced by castle-level buildings, just like how fortress-level buildings replaced village-level buildings. Open the data interface. A dialog box popped up in Kant's mind communication system. Drondheim. Lord, Kant. Balance, 62,520 dinars. Reputation, 24,300. Honor, 10. General, Firentis, Manad, James. Type, Swadian Castle. Current population, 1,500. Existing buildings. Military, Council Hall, Castle Level, Training Ground, Barracks, Desert Bandits Camp, Viegier's Shooting Range, Stone Wall, City Gate, Arrow Tower, Weapons Workshop, Jail. Civilian, House, 100, Tavern, Bell Tower, Grocery Store, Sugar Workshop, Salt Workshop, Linen Workshop, Mill, Wall, Well, Canal, Post House, Camel Farm, Stable. Buildable buildings. Military, Large Bell Tower, Footman Training Camp, Crossbowman Training Camp, Cavalry Training Camp, Large Tower, High-Level Watchtower, Large Arrow Tower, High-Level Tone City Wall, High-Level City Gate, Wooden Attic, High-Level Weapons Workshop, Large Prison. Civilian, High-Level House, Trade Caravan Station, Deep Well, Fire Tower, Watchtower, Blacksmith's Shop, Blacksmith's Guild, Drinking Channel, Small Fountain, Water Tower. Horse Farm. Agricultural Resources, Date Palm Jungle, 30 arcs, Wheat Field, 50 arcs, Chi Grass Beach, 20 arcs, Alfalfa Grass, 20 arcs, Flax Field, 10 arcs. Animal Husbandry, Single Humped Camel, 50, Desert Bee, 5 hives, sand grouse, 50. Troops, 60 footmen, 580 cavalries, 103 archers. Current troops, Swadian militia, 60, Swadian knight, 97, Swadian heavy cavalry, 188, Mamluk, 45, Sarandian horsemen, 120, Vaigir marksmen, 103, Desert bandits, 120. Recruitable, Swadian militia, Council Hall, 40 Desert bandits/week, Desert bandits camp, 10 archers/week, Vaigir's shooting range. Comment: in this barren desert oasis, the Drondheim castle stands tall. It seems to be in good condition. The clear and abundant spring water flowed into the lake, connecting the canals to irrigate hundreds of acres of land. Although the city walls were short, they had been strengthened by the attic. However, the distribution of arrow towers needed to be increased, and it did not reflect the castle's excellent defense. However, there were many elite soldiers stationed there, which made up for the lack of city defense construction. In the end, this was a simple yet vibrant small castle, and it had a great future. However, it was worth noting that there were very few women in the fortress. Remark: non-system items are not included in the statistics. The new data was already displayed on the dialog box by the system. It was very clear. Chapter 208, Miracle-like construction. The data provided by the system was very detailed. Kant looked at every detail carefully. This was the data of the castle-level Drondheim. He must not be careless. After all, to build his own castle and the construction in the future would mean that Kant had officially established himself in the Naran desert. He was the center of power. Whether it was to expand outwards or to defend in place, he had to think carefully. As for the buildings that could be built, there were many types, but they were not complicated. However, Kant's eyes were slightly stunned. The castle-level buildings that could be built were very familiar. Many of the buildings existed in the fortress level were also built inside the city walls now. Moreover, their functions were almost the same, or they were exactly the same. The only difference was that they were upgraded and not upgraded. For example, the tower, the arrow tower, and the city walls. They became large towers, large arrow towers, and high-level city walls. Although it only looked like 1 or 2 words were added to the buildings, there were much more going on from the architectural blueprint on Kant's retina. It was bigger and more magnificent. Compared to the original 5 meters tall city wall and added the 2 meters tall wooden attic, it was just 7 meters in height. Now the high-level city wall was completely 7 meters tall alone, and it was made of 2 meter long and ½ meter thick bluestone blocks. The width of the city wall had also increased from 2 meters to 5 meters. There were no interlayers in the middle, and the whole building was completed in one. Only large caliber cannons were able to destroy it. It already became the nightmare of siege troops in the era of cold weapons. And the 3 training camps could provide recruitment for the high-level troop class. This was the system's compromise. According to the original game, it was impossible to directly recruit mid-level and high-level troop class. One could only gain experience points through a level 1 troop class after experiencing a battle and slowly level up. This was the case for the Kingdom of Swada's troops. If one wanted to level up, one had to slowly level up from level 1 to 2, 3, 4, and 5. It was quite complicated. Kant had already realized this point. Thus, when the system gave him a troop class upgrade, Kant directly used it in the council hall. The current Drondheim could directly recruit a level 2 Swadian militia. But even if they were level 2 militiamen, they still lost the ability to engage in a frontal battle to the enemies that Kant was currently facing. Perhaps only a level 3 troop class light footman, who wore mail armor with a German sword and a heater shield, be used in a footman's front line that withstood the assault during a war. Only a level 4 heavy footman and level 5 sergeants who wore chainmail armor were the only person who could maintain the front line. As for a troop class 4 heavy cavalry and troop class 5 knight, they were the true main force that Kant relied on. As for the crossbowmen of the Kingdom of Swadia, with the Aran village from the Kingdom of Rhodix and the existence of the strongest sniper and crossbowmen, there was no need to recruit them at all. Even in terms of the combat strength of the footmen, the Swadian sergeants could be eliminated by the Rhodix sergeants who wielded long hilts and heavy scythes. Even the level 6 infantrymen, the royal guards of the Nord family, could compete with them. However, the Swadian sergeant was good at using a sword and a heater shield. With the combination of a warrior sword and a thick heater shield, they could directly cut into the enemy's battlefield, making up for the weakness of the Rhodix soldiers' low mobility due to the use of long hilts and heavy scythes. Kant withdrew his thoughts. He was impressed by the strength of the castle level. With the appearance of all these buildings and the elite troop class, he could completely defend his castle. Even if the enemy attacked, they could rely on the perfect city defenses to fight against the enemy. They could even use strong field combat ability the Kingdom of Swadia soldiers to defeat the exhausted enemy. Just like how they dealt with the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane. A living example was right in front of them. Moreover, Kant did not believe that with just this castle stood in the oasis in the depths of the desert, what kind of enemy would be able to encircle them for a long time. It was estimated that they would have to retreat not long after. Even the nearest dukedom of Leo. 10 years ago, the 2,000-man army had retreated in less than 2 months. The logistical supplies in the desert were a huge problem. He muttered to himself. Kant thought about it and directly communicated with the system. He issued a series of orders in a deep voice: upgrade the current stone city walls to castle level. Build 1 large arrow tower every 10 meters, 1 large tower every 30 meters, and upgrade all the city gates to high-level gates. Build 1 large arrow tower and tower on each side of the gate. The large arrow tower was 15 meters tall and had 4 floors. It could accommodate 50 archers. The large tower was 20 meters tall and had 6 floors. It could accommodate 80 archers. It could be said that these castle-level large arrow towers and towers that built along the city wall were basically impregnable. Any enemy troops that attempted to attack the city wall would have to suffer heavy casualties when they approached the city wall. Otherwise, who knew how many people were able to get close if they just directly attacked with their lives? Moreover, with the range and firing speed of Viegir's archers, as well as the sturdiness and height of the city wall, the enemy would give up their attempts to use simple siege weapons to attack the city wall. Such as the ordinary long ladders and simple battering ram, it was impossible to break through the high-level city wall of castle. The 5 meters thick high-level city wall was made of bluestone blocks. It had reached the point where one had to use high-grade siege weapons such as siege engines, siege towers, and catapults to get close to the city wall and suppress the enemy's firepower. Only then, they could take down the city wall. As for whether or not they could withstand the rain of arrows and break through the stubbornly resisting city wall defenders, that was another matter. Moreover, the Swadian heavy cavalry troops were not to be trifled with. Ding system prompt. The construction this time requires a total of 29,570 dinars. Yes/no? Along with the expenditure of nearly 30,000 dinars, the city walls of the entire Drondheim castle suddenly underwent a change. The construction team from Sunno had already appeared behind the dune not far away. The number was huge, and there were than 500 people. The large amount of wood and stone, as well as construction tools, were all filled with 100 large carriages. To upgrade and build all the city walls, arrow towers, and towers was a huge amount of work. The overall construction time given by the system had also reached 150 days. It was close to half a year's time. If it was in the real world, in the era of cold weapons with manpower as the main labor force, to be able to obtain such a defensive effect in half a year's time was definitely a godly speed. According to the game, the so-called 150 days was about 20 hours in the real world. After playing the game for a few days, it would be completed. But now, although Kant was in the real world, he still had the system time in the game. 150 days, half a year to complete it was a bit too long for Kant. With the help of the system, any construction project of Kant could be completed in a short time. The system had once warned Kant not to waste his reputation recklessly. Hence, he had kept the reputation points that he had obtained. And now, the reputation points that he had kept had played a crucial role. Now, 10 reputation points could reduce the construction time by 1 day. That meant that Kant's 150 days of construction time could be completely offset with 1,500 reputation points. To Kant, who had 24,300 reputation points, it was like a drop in the bucket. Previously, the various main quest, temporary quest, and special quest had allowed Kant to accumulate such a large amount of reputation points. Now was the time to use it. He did not need to care about the consumption problem at all. This was the reputation points that he had saved. There was no burden in using it. System, Kant directly communicated with the system and ordered, pay 1,500 reputation points immediately and shorten all the construction of the city wall to 1 day. Ding, construction time has been shortened. The system popped up a notification. In Kant's mind, the number of reputation points immediately decreased by 1,500 points. However, there was still 22,800 points left. Kant's lips curled into a smile as he used the system's golden fingers to complete the building. This feeling was extraordinary, because right below him, at the Drondheim castle, a large amount of data streams had already begun to spread. The clanging sounds of buildings rang out rapidly. Almost at a speed visible to the naked eye, the outline of the city walls and arrow towers had already appeared. And as the data stream dragged on, it was nearing completion. The 150 days of construction time was shortened to 1 day, which was almost the end of the project. The 4 city walls were tall and wide, with large arrow towers every 10 meters, and 1 large tower every 30 meters. These fortifications were built one after another, standing like giants. In front of the 10 meters tall walls, the 15 meters tall arrow towers, and the 20 meters tall towers, the buildings inside the walls were as short as chicks. Even the 15 meters tall council hall was seemed to be much shorter. However, as the main building of the castle, the council hall occupied a larger area, and the walls were thicker and heavier, so the defense was better. After all, this building had a comprehensive defense system. When the enemy broke through the walls, all the soldiers and civilians in the Drondheim castle would enter the council hall to defend. The height of the 6-story building could accommodate thousands of people, so it was no problem to retreat into the council hall and fought against the enemies. Of course, Kant would not let the enemy break through the walls. At present, 1,500 civilians could become 1,500 Swadian militiamen with once the bell tower rang. Although their combat strength was relatively weak, they were fearless in protecting their homes. In the list of buildings, the bell tower could also be upgraded. Meanwhile, Kant scanned through the list of buildings that could be upgraded and built. At the same time, he gave orders even faster: level up all the houses, upgrade the bell tower, build the footmen, cavalry, and crossbowmen's training ground. At the same time, build all the civilian buildings. With the expenditure of dinars and reputation points, under the system's rules, all of the buildings were instantly completed like a miracle. Chapter 209, The Utility of Civilian Buildings. As Kant gave the order, the system instantly popped up a dialog box. Ding, system prompt. This construction will cost 15,570 dinars. It will take a total of 100 days. Yes/no? Remark: only 17,380 dinars left after the construction. Please be aware. The system gave a warning like prompt. There were less than 20,000 dinars left. This was no longer enough to maintain the balance of payments. Or it could be said that Kant had never had any income at all, he always spent his dinars right away. If there were only this little dinars left, after Kant paid the first week of military expenses next month, he might run out of dinar. The system had no choice but to give a prompt. However, Kant did not hesitate at all. Build. This was his command. The system chose to listen. Instantly, data gushed out and engulfed the castle building below. At the same time, Kant thought continued to give the command, consume 1,000 reputation points and shorten the construction time to 1 day. Since the construction time had already been shortened, there was nothing wrong with continuing to shorten it. To Kant, he only lacked dinar. As for reputation points, he definitely did not lack any at all. What he wanted was a castle that could be built quickly in a short period of time. Ding, the construction time has been shortened. The system popped up a dialog box. Under Kant's body, in the Drondheim castle, buildings were instantly built in the data stream. It was really being built at a speed visible to the naked eye. These houses were originally made of stone as the foundation and wood as the walls. Now they were all built with neatly cut stone materials in the data stream. Whether it was the walls or the pillars, the entire body was built with stones produced in the mountains of the Kingdom of Swadia, even the roof was also built with stones. Only a few parts of the structure, such as the wall support, doors, and windows, were made of wood. The originally 3 meters tall house was directly transformed into a 2-story building that was more than 6 meters tall. It could accommodate twice the number of people as before. These 100 renovated high-level houses could accommodate 1,500 civilians. Even if 700 soldiers went into rest, it would be more than enough. This was because the newly appeared high-level houses had a huge increase in the internal living space. If packed it with bed bunks without any other comfort amenities, it could totally accommodate 5,000 people. That was an impressive number. It meant that with Kant's Drondheim castle, it could already accommodate 5,000 fully armed soldiers. As long as they met the need for food and water, even tens of thousands of enemy's troops would probably not able to take down this castle, especially with the Naran Desert's cruel environment and Kant's geographical advantage. Even if hundreds of thousands of troops arrived, they would have to die on the spot. A troop needed to put 10 times more effort in siege battles than the defending side to have a chance of winning. Because the defending side had massive advantage. On top of the geographical advantage, there was also the city defense fortifications. In fact, when the defending side's morale was high and they had sufficient reserves, it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens to take down this city. The history of Earth had already proved this point. Whether it was in China or abroad, or in the ancient times, feudal period, and modern times, it was the same. If one wanted to capture an united defensive city, it was absolutely impossible to do so without tragic casualties. Even if they managed to capture it, their losses would be extremely heavy. In the end, it would cause a chain reaction when the battle dragged on. Especially on the high-level walls of the Drondheim castle, the large arrow towers and large towers could almost be called a forest. If 5,000 soldiers were to be stationed there with 1,000 archers among them, they would fully unleash the best effect of the city defense fortifications. They would let any siege troops taste the feeling of arrows poured down like heavy rain, and they would not be able to even get close to the city walls. Currently, Kant did not have 5,000 fully armed soldiers, but he had 1,500 civilians, close to 700 elite soldiers, and the upgraded high-level bell tower. It was 20 meters tall and close to the council hall. This high-level bell tower had almost become part of the council hall. The arrow tower of the council hall had a small opening, allowing one to access into the high-level bell tower at the height of 10 meters. If there was necessity, this high-level bell tower could not only serve as a watchtower, but also serve as an arrow tower for archers. However, the most useful thing was its characteristics. High-level bell tower, civilian/military building. A large building made of neatly cut stones. There was a bronze bell on top of the tower, which could be used for daily time reporting or alarm. Attribute 1. Emergency mobilization. When war comes, ring the bronze bell, and all civilians can be called up to protect their homes. During the defense period, all civilians will be temporarily promoted to the Swadian militiamen. 2. High morale. During war, when the enemy attacks, ring the bronze bell and make a deafening sound, encouraging the soldiers to fight, and prevent the low morale of the soldiers due to the enemy's long-term siege or harsh battle situation. Kant swept through the introduction of the high-level bell tower. Compared to the previous bell tower of the fortress level, it had also undergone an earth-shattering change. It had brought a qualitative change in the abilities of the defending army in the entire castle. The original characteristic of the bell tower was to upgrade the civilians to Swadian recruits. However, they could directly become Swadian militia now. Although the level 1 and level 2 troop class were not of much help to Kant's current combat sequence, they could still transform of 1,500 civilians into Swadian militiamen and suppress the enemy with the advantage of large troop. There was no such thing as HP or def in the real world. Even if one was a powerful extraordinary knight, the one who could fight against 100 or 1,000 of people, he still had to die if he was stabbed in the heart no matter how powerful he was. With such a fatal wound, it was impossible for him to survive. In the game, if one was stabbed in the heart, it might be a vital attack. Although they had lost a lot of HP, they were still attacking vigorously like they were not injured at all. With the help of the tall, wide, and sturdy city defense fortifications, these Swadian militiamen could use their advantage in number to defend against the enemy army. If the enemy wanted to attack, even if they climbed up the city walls, they would have to suffer from the attacks of militiamen. These militiamen, who were wearing iron-plated scale armor, the militia heavy spear, pickaxe, and wide shield, were the most tenacious resistance. In close combat, pickaxe that could break through armor was not to be trifled with. Moreover, on the narrow city walls, a fight to death would be inevitable. The second characteristic of the high-grade bell tower, high morale, was precisely the characteristic that soared any soldier's morale, which made they willing to risk their lives to fight. Kant could also use his strange item, that commanding power horn, to further increase the morale of the militiamen. This could even make the militiamen burst out with a morale that exceeded their original state of mind. They would have the courage to die together with the enemy, like fighting just like a madman, protecting their home and country, and did no fear of sacrificing themselves. Castle-level buildings often had their own unique functions. After all, a village was only the most basic unit, and in a sense, it somewhat represented a symbolic stronghold. A fortress was an expansion of a stronghold, and it had its own territory. Perhaps building a stronghold in a certain location was to showcase the ruling power of an authority, but it was more important to establish the ruling power firmly. A castle was different. A castle was the true ruling center of the area, and it was the central domain of any lord. If they attacked the village, it would be tantamount to a provocation. If they attacked the stronghold, it would be tantamount to declaring war. If they attacked the castle, it would be tantamount to a deadly and ugly warfare. The castle was no longer purely military. It also represented political significance. Attacking the castle was like a slap in the face, which made all the lord of the castle lost face. There was almost no possibility of a communication with the attacker. Unless the victor was decided, or one side lost, only then they would communicate together at the negotiation table. Therefore, castle-level buildings were not only perfect, but it also taken account of military and political factors. City defense fortifications and high-level towers were like this, as well as the civilian buildings. Ding system prompt. Please confirm the construction location of the following buildings. Construction will begin soon. Among the civilian buildings that Kant built, there were many buildings that cannot leveled up. He needed to personally choose the location and let these civilian buildings connect together to form a complete channel. That's right, it was a channel. Deep water well, water tower, water diversion channel, small fountains, fire towers, and guard towers were all built as a whole. They needed to be connected to form a channel to complete the construction. The water tower could connect the live water or the deep water well. From there, the water would be transported to the huge water tower by the water truck. The height difference would then allow the water poured down form the water tower into the diversion channel. Finally, the clean water would enter the small fountains and fire towers connected to the diversion channel and could be used by the soldiers and civilians living in the castle. Not only could it be used as daily drinking water, if there was a fire in the city at a critical time, the person in charge of the watchtower would able to gather the civilians. Then, they were able to use the buckets to take the water from the fountains and the water channels to quickly put out the fire. This was the perfect water source mechanism in castle-level buildings. Even if they were in a drawn-out war with enemy, they could use fire attacks without fear to exhaust the enemy and quickly put out the fire afterward. Although these castle-level buildings were for civilian use, there was actually a military component in them. Kant pondered for a moment. These buildings had to be arranged properly, especially the water towers and deep water wells which should be the centers of the canals. They had to be placed carefully. The interior of the castle was clear from God's point of view. 100 high-level houses occupied the entire southern living area. The crafts area in the west was crowded. The governing area in the north and the military area in the east were also crowded due to the increasing number of buildings. However, when all the buildings had been built, the castle had basically maxed out the level. The next thing that Kant considered was not the upgrade of the Drondheim castle, but the development of more villages and upgraded them into castles or cities. It would be an important help for him to control the entire Naran desert. Chapter 210, The Appearance of Professional Craftsmen. After thinking carefully, Kant had already made a decision. The 15 meters tall water tower was built in the spring water behind the council hall, and its bottom was just right in the middle of the spring's eye. As the system was modified, the spring's eye that was already connected to the water elemental plane began to emit fresh water. At the bottom of stone wall of the water tower, the wooden water pump began to rotate, drawing large amounts of fresh water into the top 5 meters of the wooden water tower, which was like a big head doll, became a reserve of water source. At the same time, Kant also built 2 water towers in the eastern military region, the southern residential area, the western crafts area, and the central residential street, forming a total of 7 water towers. Next to the water towers, he built a deep water well and fire tower allowing the wooden water pump to extend into it. As long as a civilian came to the water pump and operated it, he could quickly replenish the fresh water into the water tower with the help of the water pump. It would reserve the water source to supplement the daily need for water. The water stored in the water tower would also be distributed to the fire tower. These 20 meters tall buildings could overlook the entire Drondheim castle. The observers stationed at the top of the fire tower were able to identify the source of fire and gave the instructions to mobilize the fire force on the ground. The fire force would then use the water trucks and buckets to carry the clear water in the fire tower to extinguish the fire. These buildings that were attached to the water tower would be the helpers to prevent fires. Of course, there were also the small fountains. Kant also set up 4 small fountains on the southwest and northeast sides. The 4 small fountains on the southwest side guaranteed the daily water use of the administrative area, the crafts area, and the residential area, respectively. In a critical moment, they would first stop the spread of the fire before the fire force arrived. The 4 small fountains on the northeast side mainly provided water to the soldiers of the military area. It could be said that these 2-story fountains, which were more than 3 meters wide and more than 1 meter high, were not only for viewing purpose. They were also the main source for drinking water and to put out the fire. During the daily routine, they could also admire the spring water with beautiful arcs. Moreover, when the spring water was sprinkled, it formed a mist that lowered the temperature inside the entire city wall. Although the effect was not great, it also added some water vapor, and it would not appear to be too hot. This depended on the diversion channel. The diversion channel was mainly made of stone and wood, and it actually referred to the drinking water pipes of the Kingdom of Rhodox and the Kingdom of Sarand, which formed a unique structure after fused by the system. It was even the main structure that mobilized the water source in the Drondheim castle. The construction should be more careful. Because the establishment of the diversion channel is related to the drinking water, fire prevention and extinguishing, as well as the distribution of water resources. Connection between the water tower, deep water well, fire tower, small fountain was the core of the whole water flowing system of Drondheim. The diversion channel is divided into two levels. The upper level is made out of the date palm tree trunk. The trunk was hollowed out to form the channel. It was set up on the four walls, and the roof of a house. Next, it finally connected with the water tower, and then flowed into the underground diversion channel. The underground water diversion channel was built neatly by cutting small stones. At the same time, it was covered with materials such as lime to prevent water seepage. Then, it was buried half a meter underground. Together with the 8 small fountains in the entire Drondheim castle, it eventually formed a siphon effect, allowing the fountains to spew out beautiful water. Even the council hall had a separate water diversion channel. This was similar to the Roman drainage project. The difference was that these diversion channels didn't reach the scale of stretching few kilometers away to bring the drinking water from the mountain lakes into the city. They only used manpower to transport the fresh water from the lakes and deep wells to all parts of the castle. Although the scale was small, it had all the organs, making Drondheim Castle unassailable. To ensure safety, the civilian watchtowers were also built in the 4 districts of the castle. These 4 watchtowers had a wide jurisdiction. Similar to the city management system, they could use the watchtowers to maintain order and cleanliness in peacetime, patrol the streets in wartime, maintain stability, and search for spies. These watchtowers showed the determination of the castle authority to win and maintaining the stability. It was just that there were no outsiders in the castle at the moment, so the watchtower was just for show. After all, these soldiers and people were always loyal to Kant, and it was impossible for them to betray him. As for spies, Kant did not intend to open the Drondheim castle, so there would not be these rats. As for other civilian buildings like the Craftsman Guild built next to the training ground, this was a building that could recruit or trained craftsmen. The recruited craftsmen could make siege or defensive weapons, such as catapult, tower, ladder, or ballista. However, they were not only craftsmen who made siege weapons. In the Craftsman Guild, there were also professional blacksmiths, sugar makers, salt makers, weavers, tailors, and so on. These professional craftsmen were trained and recruited by the guild, and all of them had specialized skills. Just like how the peasant was more suitable for farming, these professional craftsmen were more suitable to fill the gaps in the handicraft industry of the current Drondheim castle. For example, salt workshop, sugar workshop, and linen workshop could train outstanding talents to move in and start working more efficiently. It was far better than the temporary workers and the part-time peasant. There were even all kinds of workers needed in the weapons workshop. For example, arrow craftsmen, spear craftsmen, leather craftsmen, weapons craftsmen, and other professional craftsmen. The weapons workshop Kant had obtained this building at the fortress level. However, it was less cost-effective. It could only produce weapons like wooden sticks. They even gave up on the leather armor production due to the peasants' rusty craftsmanship and the lack of professional craftsmen. Although forging and tanning looked very simple, without practical experience, it was really impossible to complete the production of weapons. Otherwise, it would be a child's play to simply hand over the inferior weapons to the soldiers to protect their country. On a real battlefield, if there were no good weapons, the soldiers could only charge the enemy's formation with these inferior weapons. Perhaps these weapons would directly break or shatter, and it would be impossible to maintain a high-intensity battle. This would ultimately lead to the failure of the battle and caused tragedies. The appearance of the Craftsman Guild also made up for this shortcoming. The current Drondheim castle had an high-level weapons workshop. As long as there were raw materials such as iron ingots, they could completely make weapons themselves. There was no need to continue purchasing weapons and spend a large amount of dinars. Although they got along with Jocelyn, the merchant of Rivaden, they were just talking business after all. The damaged goods could not be sold for much dinars. The replacement of lost weapons, such as the cavalry's lance and spear, consumed a lot of dinars. This was a system restriction. Unless they had their own arsenal. And now, Kant was already confirmed that the weapons workshop could be put into use. They could save a huge amount of cost from buying the extremely cheap iron ingots of the Kingdom of Vigiers, and having professional blacksmiths and full-time weapon craftsmen make various weapons and armors, then distribute the weapons to soldiers. These weapons could even be sold to the outside world in exchange for great silver coins. Exchanging them for gold would then become a source of dinar as well. Weapons could also be traded for huge profits. It was not inferior to the trade of salt, sugar, and spices. The Stone Pass was an extremely good example of this. Those knights with noble statuses only wore repaired mail armor. When they saw the fine scimitar, military spear, sword, shield, and other weapons and equipment on the Sarandian horsemen, they would be extremely envious. They would even have the greedy and evil intentions towards the equipment of the Sarandian horsemen. In the end, they would die under the close-range assault of the Sarandian horsemen and the desert bandits. Well-made weapons and equipment were hard currency. They were strategic materials that were difficult to purchase even if one paid for them. Even the ordinary spear and short sword were the same. Weapons that could kill enemies on the battlefield and armor that could protect oneself on the battlefield were good things. Otherwise, Kant would not have had such a difficult time purchasing arrows. If it was not for Baron Dillon thought he still needed Kant, he would probably treat Kant like a beggar and only gave him a few weapons. He might not even give him the low-quality longbows and arrows. These weapons were the armed forces that could go on the battlefield to kill enemies. Only names and weapons could not be borrowed. This was precisely accurate. Kant understood this logic. At present, the castle-level building was basically completed. As for the remaining large jail was randomly upgraded. This building that was used to lock up prisoners, spies, and enemies was not very useful. It was randomly arranged at the southeast corner of the military area's city wall to increase the number of buildings. However, the high-level watchtower was extremely effective. This kind of high-level watchtower had a bottom floor of nearly 6 meters wide and was built with stones. It extended straight to a height of 40 meters and had a top of about 1 meter. It almost reached Kant's current height of God's view. The field of view on the watchtower was extremely wide. In a clear and sunny place with sufficient light and flat terrain, one could even vaguely detect any movements 10 kilometers away. The range of vision could be said to be terrifying. If equipped with a large telescope, one could even see clearly for 20 kilometers away. It could be said that after this high-level watchtower was built, any enemy marching in the daytime would be discovered by the guards on top of it in the shortest time possible. Even at night, with the help of the moonlight, one could also find a black mass of targets within 2 kilometers, which was different from the khaki color of the Naran Desert. With this high-level watchtower, it was impossible for the enemy to launch a sneak attack. This was because the Naran Desert was a relatively flat area where the height of the dune was generally less than 5 meters. Kant had built this high-level watchtower next to the council hall, next to the large bell tower, and even extended to the council hall. At a height of 15 meters, he deliberately built a door, connecting the council hall's walls and roof. He connected the 3 buildings into a whole, forming 3 different levels of viewing angles. As the system's rules were reflected, the construction of all the buildings was mostly completed. It was indeed a miracle. Even when Kant saw the towering watchtower and the thick, tall, and well-structured city wall and arrow tower around it, he could not help but feel a sense of pride. With the current defense of the castle, would the enemy attack? It was a ridiculous thought. Only the current Drondheim castle dared to say that it truly stood tall in the Naran Desert. Oasis lookout would not be afraid of the enemy's attack.